I didn't expect to receive the inheritance simply because I had served my in-laws. In fact, I had no right to inherit my mother-in-law's estate. I felt distrust towards her for choosing to give everything to her beloved only son without even thanking me for my support, and he has always cherished me since he was little. Nevertheless, I couldn't immediately accept the words that suddenly came out once I got married. I made it a point to support my in-laws constantly after my husband passed away, but I continued to manage work and household chores alone and also took care of my bedridden mother-in-law. She was just staring at him through rose-colored glasses as she casually talked about her husband, son, and my husband and the things they had done for her, but my name never came up. After she finished her lengthy trip down memory lane, she took a deep breath and smiled at me, saying, "If he has any trouble with the inheritance, please let him know." At that point, I felt that she had no memory or emotion for me, and even the smile she was giving me was for her son, which surprised me. I told her in a chilly voice, "Please do as you wish with the inheritance. I'm leaving this house." My name is Kelly Johnson. I'm 32, a working housewife, and my husband Ted is the same age. We met in college in an astronomy club, clicked, and began seeing each other more often and started dating Ted, who was kind and serious and a pleasure to be with. We stayed together throughout college and got married after Ted got a job handling precision instruments like telescopes. I got a job in medical administration, and we managed our daily lives and household chores together. At first, we lived in a rented flat, but soon after my father-in-law passed away, Ted suggested that we move in with his mother. He had previously mentioned that his mother was frail. Ted's brother Daniel, my brother-in-law, was currently unemployed despite graduating from a prestigious university. He struggled with social interactions and had not found steady employment, ultimately leading him to become a recluse after a brief stint of part-time jobs. This anxiety crossed my mind, so Ted and his mother thought about it and set up the house so we wouldn't have to deal with Daniel much. I wondered how they were managing financially, but I found out that they were mostly living. Just when I thought we were getting used to this arrangement, his mom had a stroke and was struggling in pain. I called an ambulance in a panic, and Ted cried out almost in tears. I calmed him down, and we told the paramedics that his mom had survived, and I was relieved. I told Daniel, who was waiting at home with me, that his mom had survived, but he didn't seem happy or worried. I assumed he might be nervous talking to me, so I didn't press Ted. Having returned from the hospital alone, with his mother staying for observation, Ted leaned on the table, covered his face, and shook with emotion. I had never seen him so upset, and after the conversation, Daniel showed no change in expression and went back to his room. Later, the hospital contacted us, and Ted went to listen, but he returned looking worse than ever. I asked Ted, who was slumped into a chair, his face pale, and he spoke with difficulty. He revealed that his mother would have paralyzed. I wasn't sure if I could manage the caregiving without any qualifications, but his mom was like family to me, so I granted his request. "Thank you, Kelly." Ted, she looked genuinely relieved and thanked me several times after I quit my job to take care of his mom. At first, she was considerate and thanked me for everything I did, and despite the difficulties, I was happy to be needed. However, her attitude gradually changed. She became harsher towards me and would yell at me over anything she didn't. I tried to stop her, but she wouldn't listen, making up her own irrational excuses. She also told me to cook for Daniel, who was picky about food, and his mom had prepared his meals while she was in the hospital. He had been getting food from stores, but she insisted I stop that because it was unhealthy. I asked him about his preferences and made separate meals for him and his mom, but even Daniel reacted the same way as his mom when he tried my cooking. I wanted to retort, but I held back for fear. I asked Ted if Daniel could still not go outside, and he seemed troubled by Daniel as well. Understanding my intention, Ted said he would talk to Daniel about earning a living, but Daniel refuses to work, citing social phobia. Additionally, he insists that he does have an income, but it's so meager that it could be spent in one trip to the store. Ted, who is normally patient, has spoken sternly to Daniel, but Daniel would just snap back and completely ignore Ted's words. I continued to smile in front of Ted and in front of my mother-in-law, and Daniel continued to handle the chores and caregiving. It was a difficult life, but I was able to persevere because Ted was with me one day for about 5 years. The police called while I was doing this routine and asked what was wrong. I answered, and I learned that Ted had died instantly in a tragic traffic accident. I was shocked and felt numb even at the funeral. With our main source of income gone, I had no choice but to continue living our previous way of life. I considered depending on Daniel to take care of me during the day, but he was all talk, and when I got home, nothing would have been done, not even the housework. He might have given my mother-in-law the meals I had prepared ahead of time, but he wouldn't touch things like changing nappies or clothes. So my mother-in-law would have vented her frustrations on me. Couldn't do the caregiving, he should at least work, but he refused, saying he had a disease that kept him from going outside, even though he never showed any signs of seeking medical attention. Eventually, I felt sorry for my mother-in-law in these circumstances and thought about getting her a care facility or hiring a daily helper, but both options were financially impossible. Reluctantly, I arranged for a helper to come twice a week, and on other days I pushed Daniel to do the bare minimum. He hardly did anything, but my mother-in-law seemed to like him and blamed me for any unhappiness without speaking to him. I recalled how my mother-in-law had always been overprotective of Daniel, giving him delicious snacks or pocket money without cause, and would blow up in rage. If I'd ever said anything even remotely critical of him, it might have been because he was her first son and she thought he was cute, but I felt that this was not good for him. In any case, I couldn't just leave my mother-in-law because of her physical state, and I was exhausted every day. Despite my efforts to support them, the situation only got worse, especially as my mother-in-law's condition worsened, and she became even more irritable than before. She would make unreasonable demands, such as sending me to a distant supermarket because the local one didn't have what she wanted, or she would complain about the old-fashioned clothes I'd bought her, finding fault with everything I did. Daniel remained unemployed. Physically and mentally, I was reaching my breaking point and began thinking about talking to my mother-in-law about the future again after Ted's death. Then, one day, Kelly called me over, and I sat down by her bed as she started talking in a conversational tone, as if we were talking about the weather. In reality, I've been thinking about something about this house and my inheritance, and I was a little surprised by her sudden start. I don't know when something might happen, so I thought I'd talk to you about it while I'm still sane. Her voice lacked its usual sharpness. Perhaps her body was in a lot of pain today, despite the usual hardships, so I remained silent, curious. Then she went on slowly. I decided to leave everything, including this house, to Daniel. I couldn't help but cover my mouth and make a sound, but my mother-in-law sharply retorted, "What do you mean by what isn't it obvious with both my husband and Ted gone? Daniel is my only family left, and he has always cherished me since he was little." Her eyes softened, possibly recalling Daniel's face, but despite her calm expression, her calm demeanor stirred within me. It's true that I had no legal right to the inheritance, and I didn't intend to demand it. But after years of caring for her and Daniel and handling their meals and laundry, the fact that not even a single word of gratitude was expressed made me wonder. I listened in silence as she described how he had done this, and how he hadn't been rebellious even when he started middle school. She also mentioned my father-in-law and Ted, but she never mentioned my name. After a lengthy trip down memory lane, she concluded with a calm expression on her face, "So Kelly, if Daniel ever has problems with the inheritance, help him out, will you? It's quite a substantial amount, so he might struggle with managing it. Oh, and keep this between us for the time being." I want to tell them myself. As soon as I heard those words, something inside of me snapped. It was like a tightly stretched spread breaking. Before I knew it, I found myself saying in a surprisingly cold voice, "No, I can no longer relay anything to Daniel from now on." My mother-in-law looked at me, perplexed, her furrowed brow indicating she didn't understand. Irrationally irritated me, so please feel free to do whatever you want with the inheritance. I'm leaving this place, so please let Daniel know that too. My mother-in-law looked up at me with displeasure. "Did you think you would receive a portion of the inheritance too?" I was at a loss for words, but honestly, I had hoped for something, and I couldn't deny it on the spur of the moment. My mother-in-law sighed exaggeratedly and said dismissively, "I didn't think you were so greedy. First of all, as a daughter-in-law, you're not in a position to inherit, and to think you'd get something just for doing some housework is a big mistake after all." Astounded, perhaps I had been hoping for too much, perhaps I was greedy, but this treatment was too much. Even after Ted's death, I had done my best, but it seemed like my mother-in-law didn't appreciate it. What had I been doing for all these years despite the harsh treatment I had endured because I felt sorry for a helpless person? Then I simply said, "I understand," and left the room. My mother-in-law seemed to start saying something, but I didn't hear the rest. I then started getting ready to leave the house, though I couldn't pack up right away. I steadily made preparations while continuing with caregiving and chores as usual. At first, my mother-in-law seemed to be watching me, but she seemed reassured that I was acting normally, and she didn't say anything special to Daniel because she hadn't heard me. A week went by, and I had everything ready. On the morning of the day I was leaving, I made breakfast as usual and waited for my mother-in-law to finish eating. After she finished and I had cleaned the dishes, I said to her, "I am leaving this place, mother-in-law." "Daniel, thank you very much for letting me stay in this house until now." My mother-in-law looked at me in shock, so I picked up my packed bags and went straight for the entrance. I expected her to say something, but she remained silent. As I was leaving, I glanced sideways at Daniel, who had stopped eating and was staring at me, but his eyes seemed to scorn me. He probably didn't take me. The place I went to after leaving the house was my parents' house. My mom lives there alone, and I had already explained the situation to her. I put my bags in the room she had prepared for me, and I took a moment to rest. That day, I spent time talking to my mom about trivial things. She didn't bring up my in-laws, and for the first time in a long time, I was able to spend time with just my mom and relive my childhood, which helped to heal my wounded heart. The following day was a holiday, and, burst through, "Hey, where are you? Come back quickly and take care of Mom, and make me some food too. I'm hungry." He spoke like a child having a fit, and I found myself sighing. It was difficult to believe that this person was older than me, so I responded clearly, "I'm not coming back to that house anymore." Daniel responded, "That's right, you're not family because we're not related by blood." While it's true that if it's just about blood relations, being family or relatives isn't just about. After I said that, Daniel didn't react right away. There was a pause, and Daniel didn't interrupt. It seemed like I was just a maid, and an unpaid one at that. I realized how little Daniel had done up until this point, so I grabbed my smartphone, took a breath, and then spoke. "I've been taking care of your mom and doing all the housework and caregiving since Ted passed away for 10 years. I've been working outside and still managing both caregiving and housework as before, but I was never thanked. I don't want to feel miserable anymore, which is why I left." As I was saying each word purposefully, a moaning sound came from the other end of the phone. He probably couldn't find the right words to respond, so after groaning for a while, Daniel spoke in a desperate yet condescending tone. He seemed to be trying to push the care of his mom onto me, but in this situation, he seemed to think only of himself, or perhaps taking care of his surroundings is too much for him, and he's overwhelmed by the. I tried to talk to Daniel seriously for a while, but it was futile, ignoring Daniel's ongoing complaints. I hung up the phone because I had no more feelings left for Daniel. Maybe he was thinking back on his actions after being spoken to in such a lecturing tone, but people don't change that easily. Daniel protested in a dissatisfied voice, saying, "Shut up. Why do you have to order me around? I'm sick, I tell you. I can't work because I can't go outside, because I can't work because I can't work, because I can't work because I can't work, 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 because I can't do it." It seems like Daniel really doesn't want to do anything if he hates it that much. A week later, as I was checking my luggage, I realized that I had left an album with pictures of my husband at my in-laws' house. Although I was hesitant, I went because the album contained priceless memories of my husband. The hallway leading to the living room was filled with garbage bags, and it seemed like Daniel couldn't even properly take out the trash. As I was about to go upstairs to my old room, I saw Daniel coming down the stairs. His eyes widened when he saw me, but his expression quickly turned demonic, and he hurried down the stairs. I walked past Daniel, trying to go up the stairs, but he grabbed my arm from behind and dragged me into the living room. Even though Daniel was a shut-in, I couldn't match his strength, and as he opened the door, I was greeted by a more terrible smell in the hallway. Damp air and a floor littered with debris and inexplicable stains. In the back, I saw my mother-in-law lying in bed. She was obviously ill and had deteriorated, which was to be expected since she hadn't been properly cared for. Told me that Daniel had asked to cut down the visits to once a week because the fees are too high. The helper was worried about my mother-in-law's condition, but Daniel insisted on taking care of her on the other days, so she reluctantly agreed. However, when she saw no signs of Daniel actually providing care and the house was getting worse, the helper suggested going back to the original schedule or even increasing the number of days if caregiving proved to be too difficult, so Daniel became irate and the visits continued to occur only once a week. Daniel called me, and I thanked her for her consideration and assured her that I would investigate the matter first. I had intended to wait and see how things went, but I had to retrieve the album, so I showed up here with Daniel. She turned her head to face me and stared for a while, as if she couldn't remember who was there. Maybe her cognitive abilities were also deteriorating. After a while, she started talking, but her words didn't come out right away. After moving her lips a few times, she finally managed to say, "Hurry, fix this." It seemed like my mother-in-law was unable to speak normally, but the words she managed to produce with her stuttering tongue were still complaints about me, even in such a state, but she didn't apologize, instead blaming me. Previously, I might have felt sorry for her weakness, but I was no longer able to feel that way. "Daniel, please ask your beloved Daniel for help." I left these words behind, shrugged off the stunned Daniel's hand, and left the scene. When I went upstairs from the living room, I found my old room that had been converted into a trash storage area. The album was still there, so I brushed it off and held it to my chest. Daniel, who had been following me, glared at me, saying, "What's with that attitude? You saw how Mom is right. At least feed her the meal she said she can't eat, the ready-made food I bought from the store." I was too worn out to even reply. I tried to leave the room, but Daniel blocked the doorway. He looked surprised. "You don't have the right to speak for Ted." I almost said something, but I swallowed it and chose to share some important information instead. "By the way, I forgot to mention that your mom said she was leaving all of her inheritance to you, Daniel. She said it would be a substantial amount." Daniel's eyes widened, so I smiled at him and left him standing dumbfounded as I left the house. A month later, I noticed a huge number of missed calls from Daniel, curious but wondering what he could possibly. When Daniel received a letter demanding payment for his debts, which were automatically deducted from his bank account, he panicked and checked his account only to discover a modest savings amount rather than the fortune he had imagined. Daniel called me to ask what was going on, and I told him that there wasn't much money left as an inheritance, which makes sense because where would the money for living expenses come from if Daniel wasn't working? Ordinary life isn't easy just on a pension. When his mother-in-law mentioned a substantial amount, she meant that if the house and land were sold for cash, it would be a lot of money given the size and location of the house. I waited on the phone while Daniel finally began to bluster and try to shift the blame onto me. He said, "It's your fault. Take responsibility, pay back the debts, come back to the house, and as an atonement, do the housekeeping and caregiving." Daniel and his mother-in-law seemed to have no sense of remorse or regret. They always believed they would be protected, and if they put pressure on me, I would comply. "It was you who misunderstood and mismanaged the money. You reap what you sow." Daniel seemed to be unusually enraged by my words, and he hung up. I don't think everyone should go through everything, but Daniel needs to learn to be resilient. 3 days later, Daniel approached me reluctantly again and begged me to lend him money, probably because he was desperate to pay back his debts, but as far as I was concerned, it was none of my business when I told him that I couldn't lend money without any guarantee of repayment. Daniel begged repeatedly out of necessity, and I told him I would visit the house tomorrow, and he thanked me, possibly the first time he had ever shown me gratitude. The following day, when I went to my in-laws' house, Daniel looked expectantly. "You brought the money, right?" he asked, his eyes shining, and I handed him a paper bag without asking. When I said I couldn't bring any money, but I brought something that might help you prepare some, Daniel snatched it and peered inside his face, falling as he did. I said the contents of the paper bag were free papers with job listings, thinking there might be bundles of cash inside. Daniel turned pale as he looked at me, and I smiled gracefully, just like I had before money. The paper bag fell, scattering the free papers. I picked them up neatly, put them back in the bag, and said, "You can." Even after earning money, they were unable to pay off their debts in full, and they lived in constant fear of calls and letters demanding payment. Eventually, their savings ran out, and Daniel, still unwilling to work, applied for welfare, but his application was rejected. When it became apparent that he had no intention of working, Daniel begged, but the staff never nodded in agreement, and they were left to rely entirely on my mother-in-law's pension. Additionally, due to repeated failures to pay the helper, their contract was terminated, so Daniel took on the responsibility for caregiving. But the mother-in-law's condition deteriorated to the point where Daniel had to help her with everything, even if she couldn't even go to a facility because of the debts. What would Daniel do if his mother-in-law died? I wondered if he would come to me in tears again, but I shook off the thought that whatever happened to them was none of my business. They never cared about me. After that, I started living alone, worked hard, found new hobbies, and made friends with whom I could talk. Now that I am surrounded by kind people, I am very happy, and I want to live a life of mutual support, always remembering to appreciate those who are kind to me.